Comrade Chairman, comrades and friends, first, of course, I'm very grateful that I have been invited to speak to this audience. All of you have so kindly come, and the book I have recently written is being discussed. So much has been said about the book that I don't really want to take too much time further repeating the arguments. So I'll be brief because I want some questions to be there about the basic thesis of the book. But let me just very briefly say about half an hour or so, summarize what I consider the main important parts of the book. There are two propositions which liberal thinkers generally advance. The first proposition is that while liberalism is concerned with individual freedom, Marxism is not. Marxism is concerned with things like ending exploitation, changing property relations in society, but the individual does not play as important a role in Marxist theory as it does in the liberal theory. The second proposition is that really capitalism is a system in which the individual finds his fulfillment or her fulfillment. That socialism, which is brought about in order to end exploitation through changes in property relations and so on, really does not worry too much about individual freedom. In fact, we know that the socialist countries we have had are essentially have been one-party dictatorships in which the dictatorship of the party has overridden the whole issue of individual freedom. Therefore, the proposition is that individual freedom is best attained under capitalism, but it is generally given short shrift under socialism, even when socialism's other achievements are recognized. Even then, it is the case that socialism doesn't really care too much about individual freedom. Now, I believe that both these propositions are mistaken. That really speaking, Marxism is as concerned about individual freedom as liberalism, if not more. And secondly, that the true individual freedom can only be attained under socialism and not under capitalism. The reason why I say this on the basis of an interpretation of Marx's writings is because in liberalism and in Marxism, there are two very different, diametrically opposite ways of looking at the role of the individual in a capitalist society. Liberalism sees capitalism as coming out of and forever being characterized by individual agency. That individuals come together to constitute the capitalist system. Adam Smith describes this very, very well. Pre-capitalist producers, before capitalism came into being, essentially what you had were people who are jack of all trades. You had to be a repairer, you had to be a kind of, suppose your cart broke down, you have to fix the cart, you have to prepare your food, you have to do everything. So before capitalism came into being, individuals were jacks of all trades. That's Smith's view. When capitalism comes into being, capitalism becomes essentially an instrument for social division of labor. That some people specialize in producing carts, some people specializing in repairing carts, some people specialize in cooking food or whatever, collecting food, or growing food. So capitalism is based on social division of labor where people specialize in particular activities. Now, if I'm doing 10 different activities and suddenly I specialize in one different activity, then in that particular period, for the 9 different activities, I would require someone else to provide me with my material requirements. Now, nobody else is doing that. Therefore, according to Adam Smith, there has to be a previous accumulation. I must have accumulated stocks which I can use vis-a-vis those 9 different activities so that I can specialize in only one of them. He called it previous or original accumulation of capital, which precedes capitalism, or which enables capitalism to come into being. And that is why some people who, because of their thrift, accumulate become capitalists, while others who don't accumulate become laborers, but they become laborers voluntarily because through the social division of labor, labor productivity increases, so they are better off being laborers than they were when they were in the pre-capitalist society being a jack of all trades. So capitalism is a voluntary arrangement. It is an embodiment of individual agency, and throughout the system, not only is the individual fulfilled, but what is more, the individual's actions in the aggregate lead to a socially better outcome. According to classical political economy, this socially better outcome took the form of an increase in the wealth of the nation. Smith's book was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Subsequent post-classical bourgeois economics, that is neoclassical theory that we know as neoclassical theory, more or less has the same philosophical biases, same philosophical conclusions, but of course refines it, changes the constituents of that theory. Firstly, it sees individuals as engaged in maximizing behavior, and that is supposed to be rational behavior. Every individual maximizes some function, some utility, or some reducing and minimizing cost or maximizing profits and so on. Every individual engages in some maximizing behavior subject to certain constraints. And the aggregation of all that is not only that the individual is better off compared to what he might otherwise have been if he was outside the system, but what is more, the system as a whole becomes socially better off, not in the Smithian sense of increase in the wealth of nations, but in a sense which is defined as Pareto optimality, namely that the system gets to a state where nobody can be made better off without somebody else being worse off. In other words, it gets to a state which is in some sense a social optimum. Now, all this presupposes that all resources must be used, because your rationality has no meaning. Suppose it in a world in which there is unemployment, I act rationally, but I become unemployed. In that case, my rational action has no meaning. Rationality must imply that there has to be a correspondence between the intentions behind an action and the outcome of the action. If there is no correspondence, then there is no way that I can actually define any maximizing behavior. So, individual rationality presupposes such a correspondence, and such a correspondence presupposes the full employment of all resources. The standard argument against it which was put forward by Keynes was the paradox of thrift. Everybody decides to be thrifty, but the outcome of it is that not that everybody's savings increase. Everybody decides, let us say, to be thrifty and double their savings out of their income. The outcome of it is not a doubling of savings, but a halving of incomes. So, if individual intentions and the outcomes of the actions in the aggregate are different, then there is no way that the individual can maximize, can actually be rational in the neoclassical sense, and there is no way that the social outcome can be a desirable outcome. Now, from this also one can imagine that this is the working of capitalism, and Keynes was the person who actually investigated the working of capitalism. So, Keynesian economics, in a sense, really cuts the ground from underneath that view of capitalism which actually saw individual liberty being achieved under capitalism. Individual liberty cannot be achieved if in the aggregate there is deficiency of aggregate demand and there is therefore large masses of involuntary unemployment. Nobody can say that in the 1930s Great Depression, when Keynes was writing his thesis, individuals were enjoying freedom under capitalism. Okay, but then Keynes, who was, mind you, terrified of the Bolshevik Revolution and was terrified that Bolshevik Revolution might happen in a country like Britain unless unemployment is removed, suggested that the state could intervene to remove unemployment. Now, the Keynesian prescription, which appeared to work for a while in the post-war years all over the capitalist world, in the sense that unemployment didn't disappear but was minimized, very small. I mean, in Britain there was 2% unemployment. In America during the Kennedy years there was just 4% unemployment, official figures. So, but on the other hand, these were very low by the historical standards of capitalism. So everybody said capitalism has changed, that we no longer have that old bad capitalism that actually had unemployment and so on, but now we have capitalism with state intervention. And look, this is so much a better system than the socialist system, which actually, true, it may be improving the condition of workers, but there's a suppression of individual rights. Now the point is that over time you actually found that Keynesianism gets completely replaced. So much is firstly, there is a theoretical attempt to discredit it. I don't know how many of you are economists, but the theoretical attempt takes the form. And this is the commonest theoretical position these days in bourgeois economics, that Keynes got his result because he assumed that money wages were fixed. That if you actually have flexible money wages, which is which is what the bourgeois theory assumes, in that case you wouldn't get involuntary unemployment, which is a completely wrong proposition. It would take me too long to discuss here, but it's a completely wrong proposition. The point is that Keynes gets his results, which had been anticipated by Marx, namely a tendency for insufficient aggregate demand and therefore overproduction crisis, because money is a form in which wealth is held. Marx assumed that money is a form in which wealth is held by his idea of the hoard. You remember Marx talks about the hoard that people have, and Keynes assumed that this is exactly that people hold money as a form of wealth. If money is held as a form of wealth, and money therefore, suppose I get some money against my sales, and for some reason do not immediately go and buy other goods, I'm holding on money as wealth, in which case demand for goods goes down, in which case there's involuntary unemployment. So involuntary unemployment, and no amount of flexibility of prices can get rid of it, because if prices fall, I may hold on to more money, anticipating there'll be more fall in prices. So the point is that there was a logical problem with bourgeois economics, which actually believed that individuals act rationally, but they are so irrational that they do not consider money to be a form of wealth, which is quite ridiculous. So the point is that Keynesianism was not only theoretically attacked, so much so that it is no longer theoretically now accepted in what is bourgeois economics. I'll tell you a story that basically a person came to JNU to do PhD from the London School of Economics. So we were very surprised. In the interview, we asked him, look, you are coming from London School to our center to do PhD. And the PhD was not in India. PhD was in Keynes. So we said, why? So he said, my supervisor in London told me that we don't do all this Keynes anymore, but I have heard that there's a place in Delhi called JNU where they still do Keynes, so you can actually go there and do your PhD. So this is the level to which Keynes has now been reduced. And what is more, we all know that Keynesianism basically ran into a crisis because of the fact that there is a spontaneity of capitalism. I'll come to the crisis Keynesianism ran into, but let me then go back to the second concept, which is Marx's concept of the individual under capitalism. Already it has been summarized, but let me just very quickly go through it. That the individual under capitalism is not a person who is carrying out any individual agency of his own volition. The individual, of course, is acting under capitalism, but the individual is more or less compelled to act by the system in particular ways, more or less compelled to act by the system in the sense of competition within the system in particular ways. There are two very different concepts of competition involved. When you think of competition in bourgeois economics, that competition is absence of monopoly. Everybody acts as a price taker. When you think of competition in the Marxian sense, which is the competition in capitalism, that competition is Darwinian competition. That unless I do something, then I fall by the wayside. Unless the capitalist accumulates, then the capitalist is thrown out because others accumulate and displace him. Therefore, there's a Darwinian competition in which some get killed while others succeed in surviving. Thrown out of the system implies there must be an out. There must be something outside the system. That thing outside the system is the reserve army of labor. That therefore the system cannot do without a reserve army of labor, and it is this competition which actually forces individuals to act in particular ways, and the reserve army of labor is essential, particularly because while bourgeois economics may make some sense in an exchange economy, it can make no sense in a production economy. Because in a production economy, people have to act in a coordinated manner. It's not just a question of me selling something and buying something. People have to act in a coordinated manner. You remember Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. When that conveyor belt comes to Charlie Chaplin, if he goes for a walk, in that case, production stops. So there has to be a discipline on every individual who is engaged in the production process to do the job that he or she is required to do in time. Now, this is something which, in a feudal system, production occurs because of the obvious coercion, the whip which is used by the monsignor against the serf. But in a capitalist system, there is no physical coercion, and therefore this is done through an extra physical coercion in the form of the right to fire that the employer has, and therefore if you don't do this, then out you go. If Charlie Chaplin goes for a walk when the conveyor belt, when the semi-finished product comes to him, then he's just thrown out. And for that being thrown out to be a punishment, there must be a group of people who are unemployed, because otherwise it's no punishment. So the point is that so this is something which basically implies that every individual is coerced into acting in particular ways, and the overall system therefore its behavior is the outcome of these actions which are imposed on individuals because of the compulsion of the system, because of the implicit coercion of the system, and these outcomes take the form of certain tendencies. Capitalism is a spontaneous system. It grows spontaneously, and this spontaneous system is one which is characterized, as Marx said, by certain immanent tendencies. Centralization of capital, the fact that you turn everything into a commodity, the fact that there are no empty spaces. You can't just leave the tribals alone. You must invade them in order to find out if there is some minerals under their ground, and so on. So the aggressiveness of capitalism, the fact that it goes all over the world, the fact that everything becomes a commodity, the fact that there is centralization of capital, these are all immanent tendencies of capital, and capitalism develops these immanent tendencies irrespective of whether anybody likes them or not, wants them or not. Okay? And this spontaneity of capitalism also incorporates the state. The state is not outside of the system. Keynes's problem was that he actually thought in terms of the state as being an embodiment of social rationality outside of the system. Individuals act in all kinds of ways. Through their action, unemployment is generated. But the state as a wise thing, the state as the embodiment of social rationality would come in and rectify all this. As a matter of fact, if the state acts against the immanent tendencies of the system, then suppose we assume that the state acts against the immanent tendencies of the system, then of course the state creates a dysfunctionality in the system. And such a dysfunctionality actually happened. The fact is that the Keynesian system collapsed because of the inflationary crisis in which capitalism got engulfed at the end of the 1960s and early 70s. And that was because of the fact that once you had, as I said, 2% unemployment in Britain, 4% unemployment in the US, and decolonization of third world countries and so on. So once you had, as it were, a loosening of this coercive system, you actually found that it's, you know, the reserve army gets exhausted, the third world producers then assert themselves, and the net result is an inflationary crisis. Workers demand higher money wages, which capitalists are not willing to concede, which is why there's inflation. Third world countries want higher prices for their primary products. Some of them can be, as it were, kind of managed, but the oil producers were not managed in 1973 because of the fact that they had formed a cartel by then called OPEC. So the point is that the inflationary crisis was an outcome, was an expression of the fact that the Keynesian demand management cannot really rescue the capitalist system. And of course, by then, centralization of capital, which Marx had talked about, had gone so far that you now had huge masses of money, huge masses of money capital in all kinds of European and American banks. This money capital wanted to go global, and this money capital was totally opposed to inflation, because inflation reduces its value. Therefore, you actually had Thatcherism. Thatcher created an unemployment of 3 million people in Britain in order to beat down inflation. You had Reagan as well at the same time. So unemployment was generated against the Keynesian prescription of always having near full employment. Unemployment was regenerated on a mass scale in order to beat down inflation at the behest of finance capital, which was going global, and therefore you had the emergence of globalized finance capital. Thatcherism and the corresponding period in the US is, as it were, the kind of coming into being of that moment where finance capital begins to acquire ascendancy. Now the point is, we come back to this whole question of freedom under capitalism. Obviously, it follows that if individuals are not cooperating to form the system, if the system is acting in an impersonal manner, and in this impersonal manner exhibits in immanent tendencies that generate huge unemployment that causes massive distress to the individuals, in that case, obviously, there is no individual freedom under capitalism. As a matter of fact, every economic agent, even the capitalists, are alienated under capitalism. They cannot simply act the way they like. They can't go for a walk. They are actually coerced into acting in particular ways. And so, since capitalism is such a system, this system cannot, contrary to what liberalism believes, cannot provide individual freedom. The only way that individual freedom can be achieved is by transcending the spontaneous system and transcending the spontaneous system can only occur in conditions when there is genuine cooperation among people. Nobody is coercing anybody else. And the genuine cooperation, a condition for that is people owning the means of production in common. And that is what we call socialism. Call it what you like, but a system that goes beyond capitalism, in which the ownership of means of production is common, is the one where alienation can be overcome and individual freedom realized. Now that's the content of my book, but the point is that such a possibility, such a vision, is something which is not just, as it were, in one's mind. Of course it's in one's mind, but I believe historically we have been pushed into a conjuncture today where it is urgent to act. Urgent to act not just to achieve individual freedom per se, because individual freedom or freedom of people is being ruthlessly suppressed at this moment. And this is because globalized capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, which represents the globalization of finance, which is really an expression of the globalization of finance, for a start, has actually, if you have globalized finance confronting the nation state, governments are of nation states, that means government policy cannot just do what it likes. Government policy has to willy-nilly accept the dictates of globalized finance, otherwise finance would flow out in large quantities, causing a huge financial crisis. Look at Syriza. Syriza was a left-wing organization that came to power in Greece, but could not take Greece out of this network of financial flows, and therefore had to do exactly what all previous governments in Greece were doing, and people voted it out. So it actually went against its electoral promise of doing something completely different. One example which I have given a couple of times in the last few days is that, look at, even when Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, there was so much outflow of finance that he had to appoint as his finance minister the same man who had been the finance minister under the apartheid regime. And why did he do it? Because of the fact that he had to assure globalized finance, assure internationally mobile finance, that no serious threat to them is being contemplated by the transfer of power from the apartheid regime to Nelson Mandela. And he did it not because he was trying to betray his promise and trust and so on, but because they were just not in a strong enough position to really impose capital controls. Now, in such a situation, I believe neoliberal capitalism, for a start, involves very substantial increases in income inequality. That's because in the advanced countries, the workers, because capital has become mobile, the advanced country workers are competing against third world workers. If you have American workers going on strike demanding higher wages, American capital would say, all right, we are going to China or we are going to India. And therefore, that is something that actually weakens the trade unions' bargaining strength, weakens the trade unions, and the workers therefore do not succeed in getting higher wages. In fact, Stiglitz made a calculation that the average real wage of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. Okay. In the third world countries, on the other hand, because capital is coming in and relocating activities in the third world for meeting international, for producing products for the international market, you may think that the labor reserves will get used up and therefore wages would start rising. That does not happen because of the fact that on the one hand, there is a crisis of peasant agriculture and petty production from whom state withdraws support. I don't have to explain to this audience the fact that the state in the neoliberal era has withdrawn support from peasant agriculture and petty production. It was withdrawing the last vestige of support which it still has, namely some kind of minimum support price for food grains, but that the farmers' agitation prevented, but it has been removed from cash crops, which is why you have all these suicides of 4 lakh people in the last 3 decades. So the point is that the state withdraws support, and this withdrawal of support pushes these sectors, peasant agriculture and petty production, into a crisis. 15 million cultivators, according to 2011 census, which is the last one we have had, were less compared to 1991 census. Some may have become cultivators, others must have gone to the cities in search of jobs. The job creation comes down because there is a huge increase in labor productivity, because competition, since trade opens up country borders, there's a huge competition between different countries to introduce new processes and new products. If you don't introduce, the Chinese would introduce and take away your markets, or the Indonesians would introduce and take away your markets. Therefore, the rate of labor productivity increase, rate of labor productivity growth rises. And that means, since employment growth is output growth minus labor productivity growth, the rise in labor productivity growth, even in a country like India, presumably, where output growth has been very high, the rise in labor productivity growth is so high that employment growth in the neoliberal period, on average, has been lower than it was in the pre-neoliberal period. Our output growth has, according to official figures, virtually doubled compared to the years before neoliberalism, but the employment growth has been halved from about 2% per annum to about 1% per annum in this period. So the reserve army of labor, because of the influx of displaced petty producers and peasants, and because of the fact that the labor productivity growth gets so reduced, almost equal to the rate of growth of the workforce, implies that the labor reserves keep increasing. So real wages don't rise here as well. So real wages don't rise in the global north, they don't rise in the global south. The only country where real wages rise has been China, and that's because of government diktat. That's not because of the play of demand and supply, but the government has actually dictated that please raise real wages. But otherwise, real wages have been extremely sluggish all over the world. But labor productivity is rising, which means that the share of economic surplus rises in output within countries and over the globe as a whole, because of which income inequalities increase. This is something which everybody now knows. The IMF is talking about rise in income inequality. The G7, G20, they're all talking about rise in income inequality. And that a rise in income inequality is really an expression of the functioning of neoliberal capitalism, one of the immanent tendencies of neoliberal capitalism. But this in turn precipitates a crisis, because obviously if income inequality rises, consumption doesn't rise as much, because the propensity to consume of the poor is much greater than of the rich. So consumption doesn't rise as much, which is why there's a crisis of overproduction, leading to a stagnation in the world economy. The decade 2012 to 21 is the lowest growth decade in the entire post-war period. And now things are slowing down even further. So there is stagnation under neoliberal capitalism, which has got hemmed in, which therefore is in a cul-de-sac. You may think that state intervention should remove this cul-de-sac, but state intervention can work only if the state can spend by taxing either the rich, who save a part of their income, or by simply using a fiscal deficit. If the state finances 100 rupees by taxing the workers 100 rupees who spend the 100 rupees anyway, then workers' consumption goes down, state expenditure goes up by an equal amount more or less, and there's no net increase in aggregate demand. Therefore, state intervention is something which is dependent on these ways of state getting the wherewithal for expenditure, and of course both these are disliked by globalized finance. Financiers are the richest, they don't want taxes on the rich, and fiscal deficit is something that they don't like because of the fact that fiscal deficit serves to discredit, to delegitimize the capitalist system, and particularly the financiers who are supposed to be, who Keynes had called functionless investors. So both, and that's why in every country of the world virtually, except the US, you actually have fiscal responsibility legislation, that you can't have fiscal deficit more than 3% of GDP. And you just ask yourself the question, why this peculiar legislation? In all countries, you don't say that you can't spend less than 3% on health. You don't say you can't spend less than 6% on education, which is what the Kothari Commission had wanted India to do. But on the other hand, we have a law that actually says that you can't have a fiscal deficit larger than, in our case, 3% center, 3% states, 6%. So, because you can't have fiscal deficits, you can't have taxation of the rich, you actually find that state cannot overcome this crisis. So we have, under neoliberal capitalism, it has run into a cul-de-sac, it has run into a dead end. And two things which it is doing are particularly disturbing at the moment. One, of course, is the upsurge of neo-fascism all over the world. We know that when neoliberalism runs into, or when capitalism runs into a crisis, the big bourgeoisie then uses the help of fascist elements, as it had done in the 1930s, to prevent any threats to its hegemony. The fascist elements change the discourse. The fascist elements divide the working class and the working people, and the fascist elements other an alternative, a hapless minority, ethnic group, religious group, and so on, generate hatred against that ethnic or religious minority among the majority. And therefore, they not only divide the working people, but get the working people enmeshed in this contradiction, which is the change of discourse I was talking about. Now, this is something which is happening all over the world. Argentina, Poland, Hungary, India, US, Turkey, and so on. And where they are not in power, like in France or in Germany, they are knocking on the doors of power. AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France. Therefore, there is an upsurge of fascism, which is really something which is very, very serious, and of course is not just a threat to freedom, it is complete abrogation of freedom. And the second thing that is happening as an expression of the response to the crisis is Trump's unilateral imposition of tariffs. That does not mean end of neoliberalism, because capital flows continue, but imposition of tariffs is basically export of unemployment. Whether Trump succeeds or not is a separate matter, depends on whether countries retaliate or not. But on the whole, the third world would not retaliate. The current regimes in the third world would not retaliate, as we already know. In fact, the Modi government has reduced tariffs on raw cotton imports from the US at a time when the US is raising tariffs on our exports to them. And raw cotton is one of those things which the farmers in Maharashtra and so on were growing, those who are most vulnerable to suicide. Therefore, you actually find that in the third world, in the coming days, the Trump's unilateral imposition of tariffs is going to bring even greater distress. Therefore, as far as we are concerned, the cul-de-sac of capitalism, the fact that it has reached a dead end, is going to be extremely hurtful for us, both because of the political imposition of neo-fascism and also the economic imposition of unilateral American tariffs. To fight this, to fight for freedom, and one of the main conclusions of my book is that socialism is an emancipatory project. It's not a project for raising production. Yes, of course, you can't have emancipation unless production rises, but fundamental preoccupation of socialism is that it is a freedom project. It's a project for emancipation. It's a project for overcoming the spontaneity of capitalism. Now, in order to, therefore, free individuals from both politically neoliberalism and economically the distress to which they would be pushed, they have been pushed and would be pushed further by the Trump tariffs and the crisis of stagnation of neoliberal capitalism, the left has to play a leading role in mobilizing the people. And this leading role must take the form not only of having political alliances against the neo-fascists, that of course is essential, but political alliances that actually take us out of this conjuncture that produces fascism. In other words, to overcome fascism, we must overcome the conjuncture that produces fascism. And that conjuncture is the crisis of neoliberalism. Therefore, we have to have also an economic component in whatever united front we form with other political elements that are willing to fight the neo-fascist rule in our country. And this economic element must be the introduction of a New Deal. I'm not saying, I would like this New Deal to take the form of the introduction of certain fundamental economic rights, universal, fundamental, justiciable, constitutionally guaranteed economic rights. I have mentioned in the book 5 possible economic rights for which we made calculations. One is the right to food, the other is the right to employment. If employment is not given, then the person must be paid a full wage. Right to universal quality health care through a national health service, as existed in Soviet Union, as exists today in Scandinavian countries, and even in Britain, despite Britain whittling it down. The right to universal quality, publicly provided education for everybody. And of course, the right to a non-contributory living pension for everybody and corresponding disability benefits. These 5 rights would actually cost the exchequer an amount which can be raised simply by 2 taxes being imposed on the top 1% of India's population. One is a 2% wealth tax. The other is a 1/3 inheritance tax, that if I pass down my property, if I belong to the top 1%, I pass down my property, 1/3 of it is taken by the state. Other countries, capitalist countries, true blue capitalist countries, like Japan for instance, has inheritance tax in the form of death duty, which is 55%. Britain and US have got 40% death duty. I'm suggesting 1/3 inheritance tax. Very, very modest proposals. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is going to agree to all these fundamental rights and this and that, but at least some component of it must be there in order to convince people that what we are offering is a new. Thank you very much. I have received a lot of questions, and let me try and answer them. First, with the advent of neoliberalism since 1979, what happens to neocolonialism? Would you like to explain? I think this question has appeared in a couple of other places also. Neoliberalism is characterized by certain specific features. First is that you have global hegemony of globalized finance capital. Okay, that's very important. When we talk about neocolonialism, there is not necessarily any such thought associated with neocolonialism. Second, that this globalized finance capital is not just something which is American or British or German, it also includes Indian. In other words, it is globalized finance capital into which the Indian big business is also integrated. Adani's are as much globalized as any American finance capital. So you actually have the neoliberal regime which is imposed under the hegemony of globalized finance capital being supported by the Indian big business, and even I would say sections of the Indian upper middle class which wants to migrate to America. Now, of course, Trump has put a stop to that, but they were votaries of neoliberalism. So there is a difference between neocolonialism and neoliberalism insofar as neoliberalism imposes the hegemony of globalized finance capital and enjoys the class support of sections within which therefore causes a fracture, a rupture in the anti-colonial class alliance. Okay, in the current era of capitalism's ability of turning necessities into comforts and luxuries and erasing lines between them, I feel individual freedom is captured in consumerism in the process of reaching the most comfortable need. How does the Marxist view suggest an individual to have his or her freedom while ensuring the needs of employment, accommodation, and so on? But freedom presupposes the needs of employment, accommodation, and so on and so forth. To want employment is not consumerism. To want accommodation is not consumerism. So let's be very clear. Let us not debunk the desire of the working people for certain minimal material conditions of life to be consumerism. Okay? And the other thing I'd like to say is that, as a matter of fact, in the neoliberal era, I mentioned the growth in inequality. There has been an increase in absolute poverty. As a matter of fact, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who happens to be my wife, has just written a book called Exploring the Poverty Question, in which in great detail she establishes the increase in poverty that has taken place in India in the neoliberal period. If you look at simply the calorie norms, below 2200 calories in rural India, below 2100 calories per person per day in urban India, the proportion of people living under those calorie norms has increased significantly in the neoliberal period. So consumerism is not something that the poor people can be accused of being afflicted by. Okay, is there any distinction between liberalism of your book and liberalization in LPG? Yes, of course there is, because I'm talking about liberalism as a political philosophy. And I'm saying the liberalism as a political philosophy believes that capitalism is not only compatible with, but is the best system for achieving individual freedom. Okay, that is not true. And what is more, the current economic regime, which is a regime of liberalization, is one under which the denial of freedom to the people, both when the regime was functioning properly and when the regime is functioning with a neo-fascism at its helm, it shows that, only confirms the fact that this is not true, that capitalism is not something which actually ensures individual freedom. What are the major components of individual freedom? I would say the main component of individual freedom is that it allows people to be creative. It allows them so that their material conditions of life are fulfilled, basic material conditions, so that their insecurities are overcome, so that they can actually there can be full flowering of their potential. They can be creative. How can you propose death duty enhances individual freedom? I never said death duty enhances individual freedom. I said death duty can be used to finance a whole lot of measures, which I call instituting fundamental economic rights, that can enhance individual freedom. Okay. Jeremy Corbyn's theory, renationalization of private industry, expansion of public sector, prevent tax tax evasion, and massive housing. Yes, of course, I agree with all this. But the point is we have to proceed by steps. There's no point talking about everything. I am talking in the current conjuncture, if you wish to intervene. There is a neo-fascist government which we have. Britain doesn't have that. So it is a neo-fascist government we have, and against that neo-fascist government, certain political steps are being proposed and implemented. I am saying that those political steps must also be supplemented by certain economic measures, and I mentioned certain minimal economic measures. So that is very much not at all in conflict with what Jeremy Corbyn is saying, but he's saying it in his context, and I'm seeing something in my context. You gave a wide presentation of capitalism and its failure. Do you think China is doing well in all aspects? No. Obviously, I don't think China is doing well in all aspects. Certainly in China, there is a lot of unemployment. And also, they have not eradicated poverty. They have brought it down greatly. But on the other hand, China is not doing well in all aspects. Now, suppose Modi becomes Xi Jinping politically and administrative-wise, one-party dictatorship, and so on. Do you suppose such a change? Do you support such a change? If Modi imposed capital controls, if Modi challenged US imperialism, if Modi announced wage increases like the Chinese do, then of course I'll support. But that is not what Modi does. And if Modi did that, he wouldn't be Modi. Okay, neoliberalism is much used and abused term. Does it really exist as a robust concept? Is India neoliberal or neoliberalizing? James Manner argues that Indian state is very strong and thus India is far from neoliberalism. What do you say, sir? If India had imposed capital controls, in that case, I would have said that India has taken the first steps towards overcoming the albatross of neoliberalism around its neck. But as long as India remains exposed to global financial flows, no state is strong enough. No state is strong enough to actually withstand the intentions or the depredations of globalized finance capital. I'll tell you, Liz Truss, who was the British Prime Minister, had a Chancellor of the Exchequer who announced that they are going to give transfers to the capitalists to revive the economy, but they are going to finance the transfers through a fiscal deficit. Even though the transfers were meant for capitalists, the fact that they were going to be financed by a fiscal deficit basically was enough to put globalized finance off, because of which there was an outflow of funds, run on the pound depreciated, and therefore Liz Truss had to resign, becoming the shortest serving Prime Minister in the entire history of Britain. So it's not a question of judgment whether the Indian state is strong or is weak and so on and so forth. It's a question of whether you have institutional mechanisms to actually take care of the depredations of globalized finance. As a matter of fact, I should say that confronting globalized finance is not a joke. It's not going to be easy, because the moment you put capital controls, capital would stop coming in, financial inflows would stop, then you can't finance your trade deficit, in which case you have to have import controls. If you have import control, then there are many goods which you would not be able to have in as large a quantity as you have been having. And in such a case, even our basic classes in whose interests we are having all this talk may have to suffer. So they have to be consistent, they have to be aware of the things. It's not a question of promising them things, but as a matter of fact, they have to be willing to make the sacrifices required for acquiring autonomy from globalized finance. Okay, why we live in increasingly fascist and liberal society. Fascist and liberal I would not put together, please. I recognize that liberalism is opposed to fascism. Because liberalism is opposed to fascism and we are opposed to fascism, there is a tendency to confuse Marxism with liberalism these days, and I am drawing a distinction. But on the other hand, the fact that I am drawing a distinction doesn't mean that I am saying liberals and fascists are similar or the same, or birds of the same feather. Further, Marxism politically is understood as a macro program for reorganizing society politically and otherwise. How do we reconfiguration Marxism in micro terms as in micro level policies? And do you see our own representatives who have largely vested interest in accumulating capital taking up such program? I never said that our own representatives are going to take up the program of ushering in socialism. Of course not. But the point is that, you see, socialism is not a question of suddenly saying, okay, let's nationalize the means of production. Socialism is something towards which you proceed by having transitional programs. I was suggesting a transitional program which was having these fundamental economic rights. I even said, let us have agreement with other political parties, not even on all five, but even on one or two. Suppose in India today you introduce a national health service. That is going to make a tremendous difference to the lives of the working people. Okay, let us at least agree on that. So the point is that one thing would lead to another. There is a dialectics of reform that leads to socialism, that leads to revolution. Bolshevik revolution was won on the slogan of land, peace and bread, none of which said socialism. So the point is that let us talk in terms of what is something which can be immediately enforced, demanded, and so on. And there's a dialectical process. Let's be aware of that. What were the limitations to personal freedom in the socialist experiment so far? Well, basically, I believe a one-party dictatorship is something which is not conducive to individual freedom. It depoliticizes the people. I mean, the fundamental problem with the existing socialist societies is that they ended up depoliticizing the working class. When the Soviet Union collapsed, dictatorship of the proletariat, according to our understanding, had collapsed. But not a single strike took place. Not a single demonstration by the proletariat took place. Please think about it. One-party dictatorship depoliticizes the working class, and a depoliticized working class cannot fight for its freedom. How the right to freedom is politically, potentially different from what liberalism is offering. No capitalist society can offer a right to employment. Okay, on this, I challenge you. Tell me any capitalist society that can offer a right to employment, because capitalism cannot work without a reserve army of labor. If you offer full employment as a right to employment for everybody, in that case you are really doing away with the reserve army of labor. And therefore you're doing away with the basic mechanism through which discipline is imposed in the production process in a capitalist society. You said giving confidence to finance capital becomes a major goal of the way governments act. In such situations, what is the near-term alternative to impose controls on capital? There are no alternatives. The point is that in order for the state to acquire its autonomy, not to be pushed around and dictated to by finance capital, globalized finance capital, it becomes essential to have capital controls. And by the way, this is not something which only I am saying. In 1933, John Maynard Keynes had written an article in Yale Review called National Self-Sufficiency. And in that he had said that let finance above all be national, not globalized. And the point is that he was smart enough to see that his idea of state intervention is something that would be scuttled if the state had to face globalized finance. Okay, how the limitations on freedom can be understood in a country like India, where majority people are in permanent partial unemployment in rural areas. That's exactly why there is no freedom. That's precisely my point, that because of the fact that people are permanently semi-employed, unemployed and so on, there is no freedom. And that is my point, that capitalism does not give you that. and therefore it is essential for a socialist agenda. Socialism is much more than simply giving employment, but that is why it is essential for a socialist agenda to start off with the offer of, as I mentioned, some fundamental economic rights. How the absence of checks and balances in the socialist states led to the dictatorship of an individual instead of dictatorship of the proletariat, and how to prevent it. You know, the idea is not just the dictatorship of an individual. The idea is that dictatorship of the proletariat was subverted by the one-party dictatorship. Let's be very clear that this is not what the Bolsheviks had originally visualized when the revolution took place. And what is more, at a time when there was a demand that trade unions should be militarized, should not play the role that they normally play in defending working class interests, because we have got a worker state. That was the argument put forward in the Soviet Union. Lenin wrote a very important text called The Trade Union Question and the Mistakes of Trotsky and Bukharin. You please read that. In that, he actually talks about the necessity of trade unions in a socialist state in order to have these checks and balances that you're talking about. So a one-party dictatorship that actually does away with these checks and balances is really the problem, not necessarily one individual. You can have not a kind of one individual person's dictatorship, but still deny freedom. Does true freedom can be possible through the 5 measures you propose? Not at all. Not at all. I am simply suggesting the 5 measures as a stepping stone towards opening up a dialectics that would lead to a change in society that would ensure the kind of individual freedom that we are talking about. So please don't think that these 5 fundamental rights are enough to give individual freedom. In capitalist system, will the state impose progressive wealth tax as proposed by Thomas Piketty? Of course not. The state would not do this. But the whole point of a transitional demand is that the state does not do this, which is why we in fact demand going beyond the existing state. But the point is that going beyond the existing state does not immediately mean a socialist state. Okay? For a very long time in India, we had what was the Nehruvian state. The Nehruvian state was not simply a neoliberal state. It was not a classic capitalist state. It was a state that presided over a mixed economy with substantial public sector. So you can have alternative states that do not amount to socialism, but that cannot be simply collapsed into classical capitalism. Okay. All right. Are we not living in an era of imperialism and working class revolution? Of course we are. Of course we are. But the point is that the era of imperialism and working class revolution describes the entire era. Within that, I am picking up a particular proposal, which is the fact that we live in neo-fascist times. Imperialism and working class revolution does not necessarily mean that the entire period is characterized by neo-fascism. Of course not. So, I'm trying to intervene in something which actually now has arisen under neoliberal capitalism, and I'm discussing that. Do you accept the Leninist theory of imperialism or not? Of course, I accept the Leninist theory of imperialism. But we also have to see the way the world has changed. Lenin was talking about inter-imperialist rivalries, which meant rivalries between alternative finance capital, between German finance capital, British finance capital, French finance capital, while now we are talking about a globalized finance capital. So the individual national finance capitals are not locked in conflict as in Lenin's time, but what you have is a globalized finance capital, because of which there is much greater inter-imperialist unity. You don't have inter-imperialist rivalry. Look at the Gaza genocide. Everybody, all the advanced capitalist countries are united. I know some of them recognize the Palestinian state, but that's just a face-saving formula. On the Gaza genocide, all the advanced capitalist countries are more or less complicit. So, US, of course, most obviously so, it provides arms, but so does Germany. So let us be very clear. And similarly on Ukraine, all the imperialist states are united, and the imperialist states have really come together. Now they have had an agreement that each of them is going to devote 5% of their GDP for military expenditure. At the moment, their military expenditure of European countries is only about 2%. Where are they going to raise the remaining 3%? They are going to cut welfare spending. So we are moving from welfare capitalism to military capitalism. And in this, all of them are united. And we are doing so because of the fact that all of them anticipate that since the imperialist system and since neoliberal capitalism is in a dead end, all kinds of challenges are going to arise. To meet those challenges, they require much greater repressive measures over the entire world, for which more military expenditure. At whom the global economy is liberal, is it not to the MNCs? No, I'm talking about liberalism as a political philosophy. It's not a question of being liberal. We use the term liberalization of the corporates. Is it not imperialist globalization? Yes, of course it is imperialist globalization. You see, building socialism is not easy. When the Soviet Union had crossed, as it were, 90 days, Lenin had said, look, we have stayed more in power than the Paris Commune. In other words, it's a daily struggle for a socialist country to exist and survive. Look at Cuba now. This man Trump is saying that he is going to now attack Venezuela. He has already called the Colombian leader, another left-wing president, a drug dealer. Therefore, tomorrow he is going to say that Cuba is the route through which drugs come to the United States. I'm going to attack Cuba. So let us be very clear that that socialism is continuously being attacked by imperialism, but the point is that in this attack, we have to be very clear. When I say that I don't accept one-party dictatorship, I'm not saying that was the only reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course not. The main reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union was imperialist aggression. The Soviet Union has enormous historical achievements to its credit. Decolonization, the defeat of fascism, the building up of the biggest, most gigantic welfare state in the world. So let us not debunk the Soviet achievement, but at the same time, it got weakened because of the political arrangement they had. And this is something which I am simply saying we have to guard against. We have to try and prevent getting into that kind of a situation where the basic classes get depoliticized because the party substitutes for the classes. Okay.